What happens when royal privilege meets American journalism head-on in the most explosive television moment of the year? It only took 35 seconds for Meghan Markle to completely destroy her carefully crafted public image on live national television, right there in the Good Morning America studio. Picture this. The cameras are rolling, millions of viewers are watching, and George Stephanopoulous is doing what he does best, asking the tough questions that America deserves answers to. But nobody, and I mean nobody, was prepared for what was about to unfold. Meghan walked into that studio like she owned the place. Designer outfit, perfect smile, the whole package. She thought this was going to be another softball interview where she could play the victim card and get sympathy from the American public. Boy, was she wrong. George started simple enough. He welcomed her to the show, complimented her on her recent charity work, the usual pleasantries. But you could see it in his eyes. This seasoned journalist had done his homework. He knew exactly what buttons to push. "Meghan, thank you for joining us this morning," George said, his voice calm and professional. "I want to talk about your recent comments regarding the royal family. You've made some pretty serious accusations." Right away, you could see Meghan's smile falter just a tiny bit. She wasn't expecting him to dive straight into the deep end like that. "Well, George," she replied, her voice still sweet, but with just a hint of ice underneath, "I think it's important for people to know the truth about what really happened behind closed doors." George leaned forward slightly. This is what separates the real journalist from the wannabes. He wasn't intimidated by her celebrity status or her royal connections. He had a job to do. "But here's what I'm struggling with," George continued, his tone still respectful but firm. "You've made these claims about racism and lack of support, but when pressed for specific details or evidence, you seem to deflect. Can you give our viewers concrete examples?" And there it was, the first crack in Meghan's armor. Her perfect composure started to slip just a little bit. She shifted in her chair, her hands moving to fidget with her jewelry. "I think that's a very loaded question, George," she said, her voice rising just slightly. "I've been very clear about my experiences." "Have you though?" George pressed on. "Because from where I'm sitting, and I think from where many Americans are sitting, it sounds like a lot of vague accusations without much substance to back them up." The studio got quiet. You could practically hear a pin drop. This was not going the way Meghan had planned. She came here expecting to be treated like royalty, literally, and instead she was getting the hard-hitting journalism treatment. Meghan's face started to change. The sweet, victim-like expression was melting away, replaced by something much less flattering. Irritation, anger, entitlement. "I don't think you understand the position I was in," she said, her voice getting sharper. "Do you have any idea what it's like to be scrutinized every single day? To have every word you say twisted?" George didn't back down 1 inch. This is why he's been in the business for decades. He's dealt with politicians, celebrities, world leaders. A disgruntled former royal wasn't going to rattle him. "Actually, I do," George replied calmly. "It's called being a public figure. It's part of the job. And when you make serious accusations that could damage people's reputations and institutions, the public has a right to ask for proof." That's when things started to get really interesting. Meghan's mask was starting to slip completely now. The practiced, media-trained responses were giving way to raw emotion, and not the good kind. "Proof?" she repeated, her voice getting louder. "What kind of proof would satisfy you people? Do you want me to record private conversations? Should I have taken pictures?" "I'm not asking for secret recordings," George said, maintaining his professional demeanor even as Meghan was starting to lose hers. "I'm asking for specifics, names, dates, actual incidents, not just feelings and impressions." The tension in the studio was getting thick. You could see the camera operators glancing at each other. The producers in the control room were probably having heart attacks. This was live television at its most unpredictable. Meghan was starting to realize that this interview wasn't going to be the puff piece she thought it would be. George wasn't going to let her get away with vague accusations and victim narratives. He was treating her like any other guest, demanding real answers to real questions. "I find it very interesting," Meghan said, her voice now dripping with condescension, "that you're more concerned about protecting an institution than you are about protecting the people that institution hurt." George raised an eyebrow. "I'm not protecting anyone. I'm doing my job as a journalist. I'm asking the questions that need to be asked." And that, right there, was the moment everything changed. Because what George said next would trigger a meltdown of epic proportions. "Meghan," George said, looking directly into her eyes with the kind of steady gaze that had made presidents squirm, If you're going to come on national television and make these kinds of serious allegations, then yes, I'm going to ask you to back them up with facts. That's not protecting anyone. That's journalism." The words hit Meghan like a slap across the face. You could literally see the moment when her royal training, her media coaching, her carefully constructed public persona just evaporated. What was left was something ugly and entitled that most Americans had never seen before. "Facts?" She practically spat the word. "You want facts? Here's a fact for you, George. I don't have to sit here and be interrogated like some common criminal." The studio went dead silent. Even the camera operator stopped moving. George just sat there, completely calm, letting Meghan dig her own grave with every word that came out of her mouth. "Nobody's interrogating you," George replied evenly. "I'm asking you questions. The same questions any journalist would ask when someone makes the kind of claims you've made." But Meghan was past the point of rational thought now. The entitled princess mask had completely fallen off, and what America was seeing was the real Meghan Markle, demanding, imperious, and completely unable to handle being challenged. "Do you know who I am?" she snapped, leaning forward in her chair like she was about to pounce. "I married into the British royal family. I don't need to prove anything to you or anyone else." George didn't even blink. "Actually, that's exactly why you need to prove it. When someone with your platform makes serious accusations, they carry weight. They have consequences. The public deserves to know if they're true." That's when Meghan completely lost it. All pretense of civility, all the careful image management, everything just went out the window in spectacular fashion. "I'm so sick of this," she shouted, her voice echoing through the studio. "I came here as a courtesy to tell my story, and you're treating me like I'm some kind of liar." George remained perfectly composed. This was a masterclass in professional journalism under pressure. While Meghan was having a public meltdown, he stayed calm, focused, and in control. "I'm not calling you a liar," he said quietly. "I'm asking you to support your claims with evidence. That's what responsible journalism looks like." But Meghan was beyond reason now. She was in full tantrum mode, and it was all being broadcast live to millions of viewers across America. Her true colors were on full display, and they were not pretty. "Responsible journalism?" She laughed bitterly. "Is that what you call this ambush? I thought this was supposed to be a conversation, not a prosecution." "It is a conversation," George replied. "But when you make public statements that could damage people's reputations and institutions, you should expect to be asked about them." Meghan's face was getting redder by the second. You could see the rage building up inside her like steam in a pressure cooker. She was used to being treated with kid gloves, to having interviewers lob softball questions and nod sympathetically at her responses. George wasn't playing that game. "You know what?" Meghan said, her voice rising to a near shriek. "I don't have to put up with this. I don't have to sit here and be disrespected by someone who clearly has an agenda." The irony was incredible. Here was someone who had spent months making unsubstantiated claims about racism and mistreatment, and the moment she faced even basic journalistic scrutiny, she was crying about being disrespected. George leaned back slightly, his expression remaining neutral. "What agenda would that be, Meghan?" "Oh, please," she snapped. "It's obvious you've already made up your mind. You're just like all the rest of them. You can't stand the fact that I spoke up, that I told the truth about what really goes on behind those palace walls." "Again," George said patiently. "What truth? You keep saying you told the truth, but when asked for specifics, you get defensive." That was the breaking point. Meghan jumped up from her chair so fast, it almost tipped over. The camera operators scrambled to keep up with the action as she stood there, practically vibrating with rage. "I am not defensive," she screamed, which was perhaps the most ironic statement ever made on live television. "I am tired of being attacked for telling my story." George remained seated, completely unruffled by her outburst. "Nobody's attacking you. I'm asking questions. That's literally my job." But Meghan was way past listening to reason. She was in full meltdown mode now, and every second of it was being broadcast live to the nation. Her carefully crafted image as a victim of circumstances was crumbling in real time. "Your job?" she sneered. "Your job should be to give people a platform to tell their truth, not to tear them down on national television." And that's when George delivered the line that would become legendary in television history. George looked up at Meghan, who was standing there shaking with rage, and delivered the words that would end her television career forever. "Meghan," he said, his voice calm as a lake on a windless day, "my job is to report the truth. And the truth is that you've spent the last 15 minutes making accusations you can't support, claims you won't back up, And when asked basic questions about them, you've had a complete meltdown on live television. The words hit Meghan like a physical blow. Her mouth dropped open, her eyes went wide, and for a moment she just stood there, speechless. The entire studio was holding its breath. "How dare you?" she finally whispered, her voice trembling with fury. "How dare you speak to me like that?" George didn't move a muscle. "I'm speaking to you like I would speak to any public figure who comes on this show, making serious allegations, with respect, but also with the expectation that you can back up what you're saying." That's when Meghan completely snapped. Any remaining pretense of dignity or composure just vanished into thin air. "You have no idea what I've been through," she screamed, her voice cracking with emotion. "You sit there in your comfortable little studio, judging me, when you have no clue what it's like to be hunted by the press, to have your every move criticized." George raised an eyebrow. "Actually, I've covered presidents, senators, world leaders. I've seen people under real pressure handle themselves with grace and dignity. This isn't that." The brutal honesty of his words seemed to stun Meghan into momentary silence, but it didn't last long. "I don't have to listen to this," she snarled, grabbing her purse from the floor beside her chair. "I came here in good faith, and you've turned this into some kind of circus." "The only person turning this into a circus," George replied quietly, "is you." Those 6 words. 6 simple words that captured exactly what millions of Americans were thinking as they watched this meltdown unfold in real time. Meghan had walked into that studio expecting to be treated like royalty, and instead, she got treated like everyone else. Meghan's face went through about 5 different shades of red. She opened and closed her mouth several times like a fish gasping for air. You could practically see the gears grinding in her head as she tried to come up with some kind of comeback. "This interview is over," she finally managed to choke out, her voice shaking with barely controlled rage. But George wasn't done yet. This veteran journalist had one more truth bomb to drop. "You're absolutely right," he said, still sitting calmly in his chair while Meghan stood there trembling with fury. "This interview is over because you've just proven to everyone watching that when faced with even basic questions about your claims, your response is to have a tantrum and storm off." The silence that followed was deafening. Meghan just stood there, frozen, as the full weight of what had just happened began to sink in. She had come on national television, expecting a friendly chat, and had instead revealed herself to be everything her critics had always said she was: entitled, demanding, unable to handle criticism, and completely lacking in the grace and dignity that real royalty possesses. "You know what, George?" she said, her voice now cold and venomous. "I hope you're proud of yourself. I hope this makes you feel like a big man." George looked directly into the camera, addressing the millions of viewers who had just witnessed this spectacular meltdown. "What should make everyone proud," he said, "is that in America, we still have journalists who aren't afraid to ask tough questions, regardless of someone's title or status. That's what the free press is all about." It was a masterful move. While Meghan stood there seething, George had turned the entire situation into a lesson about journalism and accountability. He had taken her personal attack and used it to make a broader point about the importance of a free and independent press. Meghan realized she had been completely outmaneuvered. There was nothing left for her to do but retreat, and retreat she did. "This is disgusting," she spat, heading toward the studio exit. "Absolutely disgusting." But George wasn't going to let her have the last word. "Meghan," he called out as she reached the edge of the set. She turned around, probably expecting some kind of apology. Instead, George delivered the knockout punch. "The only thing that's disgusting here is watching someone use serious allegations about racism as a shield to avoid answering basic questions. The American people deserve better than that." And with those words, Meghan Markle's credibility died right there on live television. She stood there for one more second, her mouth opening and closing like she wanted to say something, but no words came out. Then she turned and walked off the set, leaving behind a studio full of stunned crew members and millions of viewers who had just witnessed the most spectacular public meltdown in television history. George sat there for a moment, completely composed, then looked directly into the camera. "We'll be right back after this break," he said calmly, as if nothing unusual had just happened. But something very unusual had just happened. In the span of less than 20 minutes, George Stephanopoulous had done what no other interviewer had managed to do. He had gotten Meghan Markle to show her true colors on live television, and America had been watching.